The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Whoa. Landing an account this big will totally change my landscaping business. It's gonna mean hiring more guys and more equipment and new trucks for the new guys to drive the new equipment in. I don't know if I'm ready.
You can do this, and Ford Pro FinSimple can help. Our experts are ready to make growing pains less painful for your business with flexible financing solutions that meet the needs of your business today when you need them. Get started at fordpro.com/financing.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and Max Verstappen justified his and Red Bull's pre-season favourite tag by dominating the Bahrain Grand Prix, with teammate Sergio Perez backing him up in second place. But just how far behind are the rest, and did we really see the best of Mercedes and Ferrari? I'm Edd Straw, and joining us with all the answers are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Mark Hughes. Well, Scott, we'll come to you first. We'll pretend I've not been with you pretty much solidly in Bahrain for the past week, 2 weeks, however long we've been here through testing. So how was the first weekend of the season for you?
I enjoyed it. Obviously, the outcome of the race was as expected, and it wasn't the racing spectacle at the front that everybody hoped it would be, given that is what you want for any Grand Prix, but especially the season opener. But first week back, racing properly is always fun. Testing was that back at school vibe after the summer break, and then you go away for a few days, come back for racing proper. It's been busy, but it's nice because we did some videos on the way into the track each day, and on one of I can't remember which day it was because I've been getting the days of the week wrong all week because of the strange schedule. But the nonsense did finally stop, and we actually went racing, which was good. And I don't just mean nonsense as in off-track stories. I mean nonsense as in the guesstimations of testing and the speculation and all of that. We got some concrete answers.
Absolutely. Maybe not all the answers that we wanted for a spectacular season, but I think there's some interesting storylines in there and the chance for some fascinating threads through the season. Mark Hughes, we talked on a recent podcast about, is this your 25th year covering F1 full time? So
it is indeed, yeah. 25th consecutive year, yeah.
Excellent. So where does this stand? It's always good the first weekend of a season, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And it's just you get a sort of a present sort of bias, don't you? Because of the excitement of the now. So I wouldn't like to rank it not until long after I've retired, and I'll do a special guest appearance then as an old man and let you know.
That's some admirable organisation. You'll have to wait a bit of a while before that will happen, I'm afraid. You're going to be stuck doing a few more of these yet. But yeah, they are all special, the season openers. Some are spectacular, some are slightly more dull races, but they're all foundational for the season that's to come. So we'll put a little bit more meat on the bone. And Mark, we'll come to you first for the first time this year with our traditional first question. Would you like to explain how the race was won?
It was won by a Red Bull RB20, which has just got a heap better balance of downforce than the others, which allows it to be easier on its tyres, which exaggerates its race day advantage compared to the competition, which is very much the pattern we've seen for the last 2 seasons. But everybody's got faster, but Red Bull has got faster just as its rivals have got faster. And that edge of advantages is still evidently there.
Yeah, a good summary. Ultimately, it does come down to best car wins race, which often is the case. But there were some points of interest because although the Grand Prix itself was quite an easy one for Verstappen, he controlled it with consummate skill, as you'd expect a driver of his calibre with a car that had a performance advantage. But it seemed to be a bit of a battle through practice as well. I know he's always pushing and trying to get everything right. The old gear change thing was cropping up regularly through practice, but it didn't all just come magically and easily, did it?
No, it took a lot of unpicking, and the unusually cool Thursday and Friday was very different to how conditions had been in testing last week. And yes, of course, that's the same for everyone. But I think when you get a sudden change of track conditions like that, especially when you factor in crosswinds through 2 of the trickiest corners on the circuit, it very often happens that the car with the most downforce is the one that's most adversely affected. It's the one that's losing the most when it's, the rear wing is unloaded by that crosswind as you go through that transition part of the corner. And if you've already got more understeer as you turn in, which I think they biased the car very much towards understeer, as everyone did, but I think them more than most, then that sort of pivots the car around. The snap that you get is even more vicious, which means you can't carry quite as much confidence in as you would do normally. And Max was saying that the conditions of today, which are a lot warmer and more importantly, the wind direction had changed like 90 degrees and was far less severe. It just made the car a much nicer drive, a much better balanced drive, and something in which he was much more confident. But even so, even notwithstanding all that, it did take a lot of sort of. We've seen it many times in the past. There's certain tracks where it takes a lot to unpick and actually get to the car's potential. Whereas the Ferrari, certainly over the last 2 years, it seems one of its strengths has always been what performance it has is very accessible very quickly, and that looked to be the case through through this weekend. And the Ferrari was, of course, very fast in qualifying and arguably could have been on pole.
And we should, Scott, really pay tribute to the work that Red Bull's done. There was talk about convergence and everybody getting closer following what the RB19 had done. We thought when the car was launched that maybe they changed the game a bit, stolen a bit of a march. And so it's proved. And although we would rather see a Red Bull and a Ferrari and Mercedes and all these battling for position for P1 on track, you've absolutely got to take your metaphorical hat off to what Red Bull have done, because it is absolutely astonishing what they're doing.
Yeah, I always find it amazing when a dominant team looks to try and change the game further, because it happens very rarely. The other time I've seen it was when, do you remember when Mercedes rocked up at pre-season testing with the DAS system? And it was just like, this is ridiculous. This team, this is why they keep winning, because they just find these ways of reinterpreting regulations and trying to do something that hasn't been done before, or they do something that is vaguely familiar in a different way. They're not satisfied with what they've got. They really try to move things on, and that is what Red Bull's done with this car. They've reimagined some visual elements that we've seen on other cars, but they've taken anything that you think is remotely similar on this Red Bull to other cars on the grid, or other cars on the grid from the past year or two. It's almost light years beyond anything like that. From the concept underpinning the car, to the way that they lay the car out to achieve that, to the way that they cloak all of that with the bodywork and shape that bodywork to achieve certain things aerodynamically. Their mastery of this rule set and their comprehension of that relationship between aerodynamics and mechanics, and the fact that Max Verstappen is driving so well and able to adjust through a weekend and take advantage of when things, through both extremely hard work and circumstance, like the wind changing, for example, on race day, to just obliterate the opposition. And I completely agree. I would love to see more competition. I would love to see a 3, 4, 5 team fight at the front. But we had a qualifying session that the outcome might have felt a little bit, oh, here we go again. But that wasn't guaranteed. Charles Leclerc should have been on pole. McLaren should probably have had a car on the front row, maybe third. The race result itself is just the result. Is just the consequence of a simply superior car being driven by an absolutely outstanding driver. And I know it's not what some people want to hear, but that is what sport is meant to be. It is meant to reward the people who do the best job.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's no question that Red Bull and Verstappen have been doing that. And obviously there have been a lot of off-track distractions. We talked about that at length, Scott, on the podcast about the Christian Horner situation a few days ago. Obviously, since we did that, there has been a much talked about leak. Now, we reported that happened. However, because all those materials, they're from an anonymous source, can't be verified, etc. We're not going to talk about those. I'm sure people will have heard all sorts of things, but the main thing is that situation overshadowed the weekend. Christian Horner was basically saying the same thing whenever he was asked about it and just not engaging on it, which is, I guess, the inevitable thing. And I guess that's the only real thing, isn't it, that Red Bull had that distraction and the race team itself was just able to execute amid all of that.
Well, the season opener turned into a bit of a sideshow to this quite ridiculous tabloid affair. And I think the only thing I would like to say about it all is that the nature of the way it's played out with this alleged leak, and I only say alleged because, like you say, we can't verify the images, and a lot of people have tried, and Horner won't comment on whether they're genuine or not. I think Red Bull even batted away an attempt to ask if the images are genuine. So I'm not going to read anything into it just because, as you say, there's all sorts of complications around it. But there's clearly, moving past the specifics of what's gone on, the investigation, the outcome of the investigation, what some people might perceive to be a push for transparency or getting the truth out or anything like that. For what happened the other day with that material being sent round to 100 and I think it was 150, maybe 149 people in F1, of which the three of us were on the mailing list, but it went to the most senior figures in the championship. It's nothing more or less than an attempt to discredit him and put pressure on, regardless of the details and mechanics of the case itself, the allegations, the investigation, any of that, which I really, really, really hope has been taken seriously and has the right outcome. The fact that it hasn't been left with that investigation means someone somewhere wants to turn the screw. But I'll be stunned if this ends with what's happened in the build-up to the Bahrain Grand Prix, because the fact that that has happened means that someone doesn't want to let this go. And I think we will end up talking about this again.
Yes, very, very likely we will be. But yeah, there's various reasons why we're not going to go too much more into it at this stage. But we can talk a little bit more about Red Bull in general. And quickly, Scott, Sergio Perez, he qualified 5th, came through to 2nd pretty easily in the race. How good a start to the season for him is that?
I actually thought pretty good. I think qualifying, the deficit to Verstappen wasn't horrific. Was it 3.5 tenths, I think? And it should have been a lot closer. In fact, I think that nearly that entire margin came through and out of turn 1 in qualifying, when Checo, I think, overslowed it slightly into turn 1 and then had a little bit of a slide sort of mid to exit. And it just meant from that point onwards, from the point that they're at their minimum speed in the corner to the point they're both on full throttle, that he loses about a quarter of a second. But then he loses maybe a tenth or so over the rest of the lap. So actually, pretty neck and neck in qualifying. I thought he did a good job. And the race was really helped by Leclerc having trouble and George Russell having cooling issues in the Mercedes, but pretty serene progress to get into that position. Did exactly what Red Bull needed him to do. And I'd be interested to know if, in tracking the races, whether Mark thinks that Checo was perhaps flattered by Max not pushing as much as he wanted to. But all things considered, even with that big margin, it did kind of feel like as good a season opener as Checo could have hoped for.
Yeah, I think Max had plenty in hand. And even compared to last year, when, if you remember, GP was imploring him to slow down and he just went radio silence and just kept doing 7/10 under the target lap. There wasn't any of that this year. And when you look on board, he does have a lot to spare. I think it could have been bigger. It was a smaller margin of the best non-Red Bull than was last year's, but I think that might just have been a reflection on how hard he was choosing to push.
Yeah, and I think probably if you're Checo, you'll be very, very happy to have at least ensured there's no pressure immediately this season. He's done the job that he's there to do by finishing second. And yeah, like you say, that he's not there to challenge Verstappen or beat Verstappen, I think, either in terms of what the team wants or what any of us really expect. But if he can keep doing that, then they'll be happy.
Yeah, at risk of skipping ahead to something that's probably later in your running order or potentially in some of the Members Club questions, if we're going to score the people that are keen on a Red Bull seat for 2025, race by race this year, it's absolutely 1-0 Checo amongst the other Red Bull drivers, isn't it? Because Daniel Ricciardo and Yuki Tsunoda didn't have stunning races. Tsunoda undermined his own good race by being a bit immature and hot-headed afterwards, and Checo needs to open the door for someone else to come in, and he's not doing it with that kind of performance. That kind of performance is exactly what he needs to do to make that seat his own again for another year.
Yep, which is just what he needs to do. So let's talk about Ferrari now, Mark. They were the closest challenger. We were expecting him to be the closest challenger to Red Bull, and they were. Could have been on pole. Should have been on pole, you could even say. Clearly not on Red Bull's pace in the race, but third and fourth for Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc. So what did you make of Ferrari's performance, and do you think they've proved themselves to be better over a race distance as they intended? And have they got something to work with here in terms of taking the fight to Red Bull?
Yeah, they definitely have. It's a much better platform than last year's car, which was always limited by its tyre deck. To a greater or lesser extent, according to the layout of the circuit, of course, and the conditions, but fundamentally that was always its underlying limitation. This one hasn't got that. This one's got tyre deck, which, it was better than Merck's, for example. It looks perfectly reasonable. Its longer runs were pretty good in the practices, and there was no, everybody's deg is high here. It's that sort of circuit, but theirs wasn't notably worse than anyone's apart from the Red Bulls. But the Red Bulls, when a car has a performance margin like that, you can run faster to the same tyre temperatures, and that's essentially defines the deg. So yes, as Sainz put it, it feels like this platform is something which is going to allow us to just keep putting downforce on, whereas that wasn't the case with the other one because it was so imbalanced and had so many little quirks that needed to be sort of developed around. So you weren't just simply putting one brick on top of another one and making it faster and faster. He feels that this one has the potential for that. It looks vice-free. It's retained the strength of the old car in terms of looks very good in the slow corners. It's accessible. Its setup seems nice, nicely accessible to get the sweet spot. It's got a good power unit. So, yeah, I think this is a much better car. And, it's a sort of car that I think you could probably have put up against the RB19 and had quite an interesting contest. But the game's been moved on a little.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like too little too late in that regard. But, yeah, it's better than last year. Fred Vasseur was talking after the race saying, well, we are in a better situation, so we've got something to work with. We didn't execute perfectly this weekend. There's more we could have done, not only in qualifying, but also, of course, Charles Leclerc had those braking problems, the front locking that's really in the first stint in particular held him back, and then a bit in the second. So from that, P3, P4 behind the two Red Bulls, fundamentally second best, but ahead of the chasing pack. So solid. Yeah, they're just going to need a really quick development rate. Interesting to see a little bit of Sainz versus Leclerc battling as well, though, wasn't it, Scott? Given, obviously, Sainz knows he's out at the end of the year, whatever happens. So he's determined. I mean, he'll play the team game, but he wants to make sure that he shows what he can do.
Well, he's sending a message every time he beats Leclerc or goes wheel to wheel with him, isn't he? He's advertising himself to others, and he's also just reminding Ferrari of what a good driver they're letting go. I think Ferrari probably could have handled that slightly better. Like, Leclerc had such an obvious problem, it didn't make any sense to let them race one another. And I think they did accidentally undercut Leclerc past Sainz, didn't they, with the way that they did the pit stops. I was interested, actually, because Sainz was rightly very happy with his performance and his pace, but Leclerc was absolutely adamant that had he not had that locking issue and had he been able to run the race that he should have been able to run with track position, he would have finished second, and the gap to Verstappen wouldn't have looked as dramatic as it was. And it sets the scene quite nicely with those two, because they're going to want to assert themselves over the other for different reasons this year. Sainz for the reasons I mentioned just now, in terms of sending a message and advertising himself, but Leclerc because he's going up against Lewis Hamilton in the next couple of seasons, and whether he beats or doesn't beat Lewis, he's doing it against one of the greatest drivers ever. If he loses in his final season against Sainz or looks unspectacular against Sainz, that's a bigger blow to him than I think anything that could happen in 2 years alongside Hamilton. So there's actually quite a lot at stake, I think, between these two drivers. In the short term, the main thing is what they're actually able to do with this car. And I don't really think Ferrari executed a perfect race across either car, obviously for Leclerc, but even with Sainz, with the way they handled that battle between the two of them. So there's clearly room to improve. It does look like a good baseline. The question is whether or not all of those things that Mark talked about earlier, in terms of exaggerating Red Bull's advantage, come back enough, combined with Ferrari stepping up and getting more out of this car, to make a fight further down the line. That's the big unknown, and that's obviously what we'd like to see, because you just want that competition at the front.
We'll come on to Mercedes in a moment, but I wanted to talk a little bit about McLaren first, Scott. The reason being that in qualifying, Lando Norris felt the pace was there to have been on the front row, maybe. So ahead of the Mercedes, of George Russell, and also even perhaps an underperforming Ferrari. So P6 for Norris and then P8 for Oscar Piastri, and the race seemed a little bit subdued. So what do we learn about McLaren's form and the strengths and weaknesses of that car?
Yeah, if you looked at the ideal laps, not even just what Norris thought, there was clearly a much better qualifying result on the table. But actually, I don't think that car was any better than the third or fourth fastest car here. This track isn't best suited to that car, and the reason it's not best suited to that car is it's still not the all-rounder they need it to be. The lingering weaknesses we know that are there, in particular slow speed difficulties and the way the car is a little bit hesitant to rotation. It's difficult to get the car through the corner, especially in the middle of the corner. That's all still there. That resolving that is not the work of a moment. Otherwise, as Norris puts it, they'd have solved it a long time ago. And actually, through the winter, I think they realised that between what they want to do aerodynamically and mechanically, they just need more time. And these are items that aren't worth signing off early to get on the car for race one. So it's not quite the same as missing targets like they did last year. It's just the magnitude of the task at hand. So their big focus at the moment from the aerodynamics group is on low speed aerodynamic performance. And then on the mechanical side, they're looking to introduce a few things, don't know the specifics yet, but to just broaden their setup options. I think they want to see what they can do. I think they need to add something mechanically to the car to give them a bit more of a window to play with in terms of how they set it up mechanically. So you do that so that you've got more options at the track, and then you also add pure aerodynamic performance at low speed. And I actually got Andrea Stella to explain sort of what that meant, and without going into too much detail here, he ended up taking a notebook of one of my colleagues and actually drawing a little diagram of a car going through two different angles of corners to explain how different it is when you're trying to develop a car aerodynamically for cars with different levels of steering lock and different speeds, and the way the airflow will hit the car and from different sides. It was fascinating, but it also just showed how specific and scientific they need to get on top of this specific problem. It's not just a case of just adding load generically. So I think that's where McLaren's at. I don't think this is a car that is improved enough to be a threat on a circuit like this. But clearly they have improved a reasonable amount over the winter anyway with what they have been able to do for race one, because I don't think the car at the end of last year would have got this result. And obviously, if you think back to where McLaren were in Bahrain 12 months ago, this is miles ahead of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a reasonable foundation for them. Fourth quickest all round. They'll probably be a little bit disappointed with that, but
they should be better in Jeddah.
Exactly. So we'll see how they get on in a week's time.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Right, Mark, let's get on to Mercedes now, because there was a lot of positivity from the drivers about that improved rear stability. A solid foundation to build from was the message they keep putting out. How disappointed were you to see the best Mercedes in 5th place and 47 seconds behind Verstappen? And perhaps you can explain some of the reasons why that perhaps wasn't entirely representative.
Yeah, that was an underperformance. And as you say, the messaging is very like Ferrari's in that this car doesn't have the vices of the old car, and it's a sort of clean, hygienic sort of foundation, if you like, for us to develop and just, add downforce as we develop it. Unfortunately, they made an optimistic choice with the cooling levels for the bodywork. They'd gone, as you recall, Hamilton went quickest in FP2, which rather surprised them, and they'd realised they've probably erred a little bit too much towards the qualifying in the compromise that you have to make, well, everywhere, but a lot here between qualifying and race pace, because you have to protect rear tyres so much and put a level of understeer in the car. The setup that it arrived at on Thursday was very fast over a single lap, but that's not what they were intending to do. So they had to sort of dial back a little bit on that, except that they were sacrificing some qualifying time because that was really unrepresentative. And in order to try and claw back some of that they'd given up, they chose the most closed of all the bodywork options that they had available to them, which turned out to be wrong, because race day was, although it was always forecast to be warmer than Thursday and Friday, it was warmer by a greater extent than had been forecast. So within 3 or 4 laps, both drivers were getting the big warning light saying power unit too hot, and it was affecting how the battery was operating too. So they were in a bit of a mess, and they were lifting and coasting sort of 100 meters earlier than they would ideally have been standing on the brakes. So it was a shame, really. A little operational detail that, as Russell said, would maybe have cost them, if they'd gone the next level up of cooling, opening it up one more level, it would maybe have cost them 4 milliseconds of qualifying lap time, but it's ended up costing them 0.4 per lap of race time. So you say, well, where would that 0.4 per lap have put it in the race? And about on level with Sainz. So just as testing looked, it seems very equally matched with the Ferrari. It's a sort of similar level of competitiveness to the Ferrari. But they sort of compromised themselves a little bit by being just a little bit too racy in their bodywork choice.
Yeah, and Russell was P5, Hamilton P7 in the end in that race. But yeah, Toto Wolff was being sort of gently positive after the race, again stressing the fact they have got a car they can work with, and feeling that it was very much in the forefront of that chasing pack behind Red Bull. But he did admit that, yeah, Red Bull are in a different galaxy, and that although the fact that their performance is better and they've got a car that has that mechanical platform that they can work with and they should be able to just add performance to, he said it's sort of a very thin silver lining you can just about see for them in terms of being able to fight with Red Bull. So a lot of work to be done there, but at least Mercedes don't feel they'll just be going round and round in circles, hitting the same problems as perhaps they've done in 2022 and 2023, slightly different problems in each of those 2 years, but never with a baseline car that could be developed enough to be a threat to Red Bull. This one at least has got a lot more to go. So yeah, again, positive. And also we have to say it's got a good start for Russell in terms of his season. He wants to show that he can be the long-term team leader. Toto Wolff said he's the potential Mercedes team leader for the future. So a good start for him to be the lead driver in qualifying and the race.
Yeah, exactly. He just, I think he needed a nice, sensible weekend more than anything after last season being so up and down. So just to get through the potential pitfalls of this weekend, not just with the specific issues they had in the race, but also just how tight that group was from 2nd to 9th in qualifying was 3 tenths or so. You really had to execute well to start at the head of that pack. So Russell nailed it when it mattered. I was worried in the race early on that he had gone a bit too early in the first stint. We've seen it a few times. He has done that and taken too much out of the tyres. So when he started to then fade, I was fearful that was the payback basically for his over enthusiasm at the start of the stint. But I think that was more down to the cooling issues and management than anything else. So give him the benefit of the doubt there. I thought he did a very good job overall. It'll be interesting to see sort of how that dynamic shifts with this car going forward. It shouldn't be quite as peaky and swingy as the last couple. So I would expect to see both drivers being able to put in consistently good performances going forward. Obviously, Hamilton was just hamstrung by ultimately not quite delivering when he needed to in qualifying.
Yeah, absolutely. I think overall, we did get a pretty clear picture from this top 4 with, to go back to what we're doing in testing, we're ranking the teams. Red Bull clearly leading, Ferrari second, Mercedes perhaps just behind, but a lot closer than they looked in this race, and then McLaren sort of fourth best, but that's just based on one circuit. And that, of course, brings us to fifth best, Aston Martin, Scott. And they were really interesting because the cars look quite nice on track since the start of testing. And I must admit, as the weekend went on, I was starting to think, oh, maybe this Aston's got a bit more race pace than I thought it had. And then the race happened, and I said, no, it hasn't got more race pace than I thought it had.
Yeah, but that's because you're underestimating the exceptional job Fernando Alonso did in qualifying. Not my words, his.
But it's not like Fernando Alonso to talk himself up. It's frustrating, Alonso, because he talks himself up and you want to think he's just exaggerating, but he's so good.
But to be fair with this one, he played it brilliantly. I don't think he was doing it intentionally in qualifying on Friday evening.
Oh, you got the day right for the first time this weekend.
I know. I'm so proud of myself. But he just did it. He built on it so perfectly after the race. Because after qualifying, he told us that he was massively surprised to be sixth because the one lap pace hadn't been particularly stunning, and they'd had to do a lot of work, I think, here this week to get the car in a better window. He said he felt more connected in it. And he was optimistic because he was thinking, well, the long runs have been a bit so-so, but generally they're better in race trim than they are one lap pace, so this could be quite good. So then when he came over to us after the race, I said, yesterday it was a surprise. Was it a negative surprise today? And that's when he was just like, no, that just proves that yesterday was exceptional by me. So it's just amazing. He teed it up as just like, look at how much we've over. What a massive surprise how impressive we've been in qualifying today. This is fantastic. 24 hours later, that was all me, baby.
How very Fernando Alonso. But interesting that he'll be a bit concerned about the performance of the Aston.
Well, in his words, they were in nobody's race.
Well, that's very true. Well, I was just double-checking the gap. It was 74 seconds Alonso was off the lead. And absolutely, Alonso with Stroll, who did that recovery drive after the spin at the first corner, not his fault, incidentally, very much on their own. They're ahead of the lapped field, as it were, from P11 downwards, although Stroll was very close to being lapped. But, yeah, 18 seconds off the top eight. So some work to be done there from Aston Martin. They do look like kind of where they look like they might be, just they're sort of a bottom part of Q3 team.
Yeah, I'm a little bit worse than I expected them to be. I mean, we thought it was a coin flip between them and McLaren for this circuit in particular. To have not been able to beat McLaren at McLaren's worst track, or one of their worst tracks rather, certainly a recent bogey track for McLaren, I think is cause for concern. The silver lining for them is that they won't go into too much detail, but they're talking a good game at the moment in terms of how they've completely changed the philosophy of preparing the base car, basically, and then setting it up for development through the season to rectify what they got wrong and why last season in terms of stagnation with the upgrades that they brought and the fact that they actually managed to bake in more negative characteristics as the season went on. So Alonso sort of talking, I think he even used, I can't remember the exact phrase he used, but he compared it to McLaren last year and said that they need to do what McLaren did last season and develop super strongly and have a great second half of the year. But they're actually starting this year better than McLaren started last year. But I think we can't just take it on trust that Aston are going to have a better development rate this season. We just can't. They need to prove it, and they're going to need to have upgrades on the car quickly if they want to do anything more than just snipe for lowly points finishes. Because 2 cars in the points is fine. They actually have achieved their target for this Grand Prix in doing that. But the 2 lowest point scoring positions that's not good enough for a team with the ambition that they have.
Yeah, I think the fact, we talked about it last year on a few occasions, that period early last year when they were the second fastest car, we did say this was largely because of Ferrari and Mercedes having under-delivered so spectacularly in the second year of these regulations. And it was a sort of a false picture, really. And if
circumstance.
And if you look at how far away they actually were from the pace last year, even though they were the second fastest car in the race, they qualified at 100.7% of pole. This year it's 100.4, so it's actually quicker relative to pole than last year's car. It's just that there's a whole lot more teams in between them now.
While we're on Aston Martin, Scott, what do you make of that first corner incident involving Stroll and Hülkenberg?
Really unlucky for Stroll. Really unlucky. I know last season he had a mix of misfortune and just not being good enough, but that wasn't anything he could have done. He had a great start. He made the most of that. The Hülkenberg did not have a great start, and he was so comfortably in the position he needed to be in for turn one, was doing nothing wrong, well positioned on the inside line. Hulk probably in a little bit of kind of desperation to make amends for the bad start, kind of half put the nose up the inside, then bailed out of it. Needed to slow up a little bit much. It was quite an aggressive bit of braking, I think, just as you get to the entry. And then I don't really think Stroll checked up particularly at the apex or anything like that. It's just Hulk just kind of slid into him in the middle of the corner, biff, round he goes. And at that point, no way do you think if you're Lance Stroll or Aston Martin that you're getting a point out of that car by the end of it. So absolutely fair play. I think they put him on quite an aggressive strategy, like to pull off. But I just genuinely think he did a really good job in managing that. Track position's great here, but you still need to do a lot with it.
Yeah, I think he pitted on lap 9, which is quite early for a two-stop race. So he and Joe were the
He did
first
more than 30 laps, I think, and I'm pretty sure he was the only person to do that in a stint.
Yeah, because he pitted for the second time on lap 27, which was one before Joe. So yeah, he was the first sort of to do a second stop. So well executed drive, and just quite unhurriedly made his way through. I mean that in a good way. Climbed up to 10th place, finished pretty much
Just
where...
patient and did what he needed to do.
He was where the second Aston Martin needed to be. So yeah, absolutely fine. Decent weekend for Lance Stroll. Mark, we sort of had a split field, didn't we? We had that top 5 group that we've covered. And then there was a second group with RB to the 4 in qualifying, Sauber in front come the finish, courtesy of Zhou Guanyu. But how close is that group that's also got Haas and Williams in it? And what did you make of the competitive pattern there?
It's very difficult to define the exact competitive order in that group, other than Alpine's at the back of it. And we don't know exactly how quick the Haas is over a race stint, because Hülkenberg did that brilliant lap which got him into Q3, but then it was in the pits at the end of the first lap for a new nose. And so his race got really, compromised. So we didn't see him doing a proper, clear representative run. Kevin Magnussen just was nowhere near Hülkenberg's pace this weekend, so we haven't really got a reading there. Alex Albon was having all sorts of problems with his power unit, so the Williams showing wasn't representative. Zhou Guanyu did a very good job coming through in the Sauber to sort of head that pack, and did a better job than RB, but not on pure pace. It was just positioning, and the pace was about the same as the RBs. So I think I wouldn't like to call it in among that group, other than I say the Alpines are at the back of it. And just as a further illustration of what I was talking about with the Aston comparison and pure pace, the Alpines on the back row were 1.8% off pole, and if you'd done 1.8% off pole last year, you'd have been 11th on the grid. So it does show that the performance is closing up, but the identity of the teams and within its the order of the teams within it, it's not really all that mixed up, other than the fact that Alpine's sort of fallen back.
Yeah, we'll come on to them a little bit later. But now, let's have for the first time this season the return of the Race F1 podcast favourite. And for 2024, it's got its own little intro, which we're going to give its debut now.
Welcome to Valtteri Bottas Sympathy Corner.
So what do you think of that, Mark? That's the first time you've heard that.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I like the fact you got him involved in it. That's great.
I say this with complete respect for the body of work you have produced at the race and in previous things you've done, Ed, but that's the best thing you've ever done.
Well, I've wanted to do it for a while, but obviously technically we can't record in the paddock because we don't have the broadcast rights. But obviously at the launch, it was fine. So, and Valtteri, to his credit, Valtteri's he's a really good guy, and he always gets into the spirit of these things. He was more than happy to do it.
He is, I reckon he's the only driver on the grid who would do it, because I just think everybody else either falls into a category of absolutely going nowhere near this, would want to do it but takes themselves slightly too seriously, or would be up for doing it, but isn't really confident that like it's the right thing for them to do, or something like that. Bottas is, I genuinely think, in a class of one for being up for doing that.
Absolutely,
and fair play to him. He's what a good sport.
I must admit, I'm a little bit in. It's difficult to know what to feel about this, because I was quite hopeful that we'd be able to go to Valtteri Bottas sympathy corner at some point fairly soon in the season, because I really wanted us to deploy that. But I was really hoping that things would go well for Valtteri Bottas. So can you explain why they didn't, Scott?
Because of the aforementioned Hulkenberg-Stroll clash. Bottas actually for well, not once, but it was a very good start from Bottas, and he wasn't making himself vulnerable down into turn one. His positioning wasn't a bit soft. He wasn't weak in combat or anything like that. He was just desperately unlucky. That's why we're in sympathy corner, because he gets to the apex of turn one. I mean, obviously there's some checking up with the Hulkenberg-Stroll clash in front of him, and then all of a sudden he's having to take evasive action because there is an Aston Martin broadside in front of him. So yeah, the epitome of Valtteri Bottas sympathy corner. But I'm sure fortunes will turn around sooner rather than later, and I'm not going to give anything away, but we might have something a little bit in store if they do.
Well, let's hope so. But the thing is, he didn't get out of Valtteri Bottas sympathy corner even after the first lap, because then he had that second pit stop. There was the front left wheel nut problem, and he was stuck in the pit box for an extra 50 seconds. His race was already over by then anyway, because he had front wing damage. He was
peak Bottas
but
bad luck.
It was just everything's going right. It's funny, I ran into him sometime after the race, and I just said, "Oh, you had a brilliant race for 10 seconds," because it was going really well as he took off out the inside. But he does have a bit of bad luck, Valtteri Bottas, and
I think he might be the unluckiest driver on the grid. Just think back to not just like the last couple of seasons with Sauber where things have gone wrong, but like some of the Mercedes seasons were so plagued by bad luck. And like some people who like might be new to the podcast or even maybe listening for the first time, this isn't mocking Bottas. Like when we do this, like I think all of us get on really well with Valtteri, because he is genuinely a lovely guy as well as a very good racing driver, and this whole thing comes from genuinely a sustained period of expressing sympathy for him on various iterations of podcasts that we've done over however many years now.
Yeah, it's just he seems to have a bit of bad luck, and it's a real shame. Well, I did say to him at the launch, I hope we won't have to visit you in sympathy corner too often, and he was very hopeful about that. But here we are straight away at the first race. Let's hope we don't go there in Saudi Arabia. Really, doesn't deserve that. But let's now finally get on to Alpine. I don't know what corner Alpine belong in.
Misery corner.
Well, yeah, there's all sorts of very negative phrases, but a back row lockout for Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly, 17th and 18th places in the race, ahead only of Valtteri Bottas, who had the problems we've already talked about, and Logan Sargent, who basically had to stop with his steering wheel issue for a while. So they were last of the people who had something approaching a normal race. And we had quite a few questions from the Race Members Club about this, actually, to anticipate the final section. Andy Barber just asked, why is Alpine so slow? So, Mark, what can you tell us?
They're down on power. They're overweight. Straight away, you're looking at probably over half a second of lap time just in those two combination of those two problems, the limitations, and it's that would put it, with a competitive engine, and had they got it down to the weight limit, it would put it in that pack with the RB and the Williams and the Sauber, etc. But it's not, and that's just where they are, and it's going to have. We're already seeing that there are consequences in terms of the personnel changes we're already hearing about.
Yeah, exactly. As we've reported, we understand that Alpine won't comment on this at all, but Matt Harmon, the technical director, and Dirk de Beer, the head of Aero, tendered their resignations at some point before this race. It wasn't like they had the race and then they resigned. They had already done that, and they're serving out whatever form of notice period. We don't know what the exact terms are, but Harmon was still on the pit wall. But yeah, so much has gone wrong there. They had the problem, they failed the lateral crash test on the chassis. That's where a lot of the weights come from, because they had some weight saving measures in the monocoque, and simulation told them it was all fine. Did the lateral test, it wasn't fine, and they've had to take some corrective action that has just added a heap of weight into the monocoque. So that's the main reason for that. Aero-wise, the car isn't working that well. It's not great on traction. You mentioned the power issue. So there's a lot not really working there. The only saving graces are the fact that the Alpine never goes particularly well at this track because it is a bit weak on traction. It'll hurt particularly in Bahrain, and things are quite close, but this is a works team that's been slowest, and it's going to take a huge amount for them to even recover to sixth place that they got last year, and that wasn't even that good. So they need some new technical leadership now as well, and it's just a horrible situation. You sort of wanted to think they were on the right sort of track, and in some ways they were executing better trackside at the back end of last year. I think the team trackside under Julian Rouse is working reasonably well, but they've just got a car that's not working, and it's just another circle of these problems, Scott. It's just,
but it's more aggressive. But it's not like, I genuinely think the cycle of misery is getting worse, because you look at where they've gone through in a very quick potted history as they come in and struggle, obviously, because of what they took over from what was Lotus. Improve, peak, regress, implode, improve, peak, regress, implode, and then somehow step back further. They've not done that before. The couple of times we've seen this team dip since the Renault Works team came back in, it has followed. What has followed is a pretty immediate bit of recovery, but that's not happening because the car's overweight, the car's not very good, the car desperately needs upgrades. The most senior technical figures have presumably thrown in the towel, or they've been invited to leave, and so they've gone, yep, fine, I'll just get out of this. Every senior position in this team from a management point of view and a technical point of view is different to what it was a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. I was really hoping after where it got to at the end of last year and some of the things that we were hearing over the winter and the way they were positioning it at the launch and ahead of the new season, that there was less and less Renault nonsense creeping in to the race team. But there has to be something fundamental that is just stopping this organisation from being run properly, efficiently, successfully, whatever word you want to use. Because we don't know the details of why Harman and De Beer have resigned. But I don't have faith that it's not going to be something silly like them saying, Harman saying, we need to do X, we need the resource to do X, this needs to be improved. And Renault Group saying no. Because that would fit perfectly with that organisation not backing this team and not backing the people and not giving them the time and not giving them the resources that they need. They expect everything to be done at 3/4 or 4/5 of what a real works team would actually have, and they want it done yesterday. And I just don't think they know I don't think they know what they want that F1 team to be, and I don't think they know how to go about doing it.
Yeah, you've got to ask, what's Luca Di Maio, the boss of Renault, doing at this stage? Because as we talked about before, it's best served if Renault just steps back, give the team what they need to do, invest in the facilities or whatever. Because you're right, it can't just be all the people who've run this team over the past X years in the technical roles and the management roles are all just idiots and none of them can do it. It's like a football club. If you have 10 consecutive managers who are all underachieved, you've got to start looking at elsewhere rather than just thinking all of these football managers are idiots. Well, look at there's more to it than that.
A different example, look at Williams. Look at the people that have come through Williams in the last few years. They've achieved success elsewhere, or they've then gone on and looked good elsewhere. Can't change anything until other big, serious change happens, and that's starting to happen there. It's a different example, but it proves that point. Like, it isn't just individuals that are to blame.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's also not the workforce at Enstone. That's another thing to massively stress.
Lots of good people there. And it's frustrating because Bruno Famin, who's the team principal, he's saying the right things. He's talking about none of these 100 race plans, 5-year plans. It's like, right, constant improvement in all area. He's a very hard worker. A lot of people speak very highly of what he's doing. Does he have the level of autonomy he needs to make things work and to invest? I don't know. But history tells me that Renault-owned Formula One teams very often not to. They tend to succeed in spite of the Renault ownership and with some distance there. We'll see what happens. The one thing I will say is there's no McLaren-like revival 3 months away like last year, because McLaren started the season badly, but they said, right, we've got a plan, we're doing this, we're really confident in this. Alpine have just got the easy bit of that equation, the uncompetitive car. But I don't think they've got the answers, and there's a lot of things that need to be done. They've missed targets aero-wise. There's still some work to be done. And in the meantime, they're just going to have to wring everything they can out of the limited machinery they've got. And I think they actually did a pretty good job at the weekend, the drivers and the team. They did what they could, but there just wasn't more there. Maybe it'll be a little bit better at Saudi, but it's not going to be much better. This is going to be a long-running and very tough story. So, yeah, more tough times for everybody at that team, and fascinating to see how they act in terms of what they say and communicate about this, and how they go about appointing replacements. The fact they're still working on, maybe they're trying to persuade Matt Harmon to stay on or something. I don't know. He was there on the pit wall. Everyone has notice periods, etc. So let's see what goes on there.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Jewelry can say many things on your wedding day. As a wedding band, it can say, "This is a forever symbol of our forever love." As a gift to your wedding party, it can say, "Thanks for standing up there with us." Blue Nile can help you find the piece that says it all, and says it beautifully, with expert guidance and a wide assortment of jewelry of the highest quality at the best price. Go to BlueNile.com and experience the convenience of shopping Blue Nile, the original online jeweler since 1999. That's BlueNile.com.
Well, as is our style, the final part of the podcast is dedicated to questions from the Race Members Club about the Bahrain Grand Prix. So thanks to everyone who supports the race for your many questions. We'll try and get through as many as we can, and apologies because we won't get to all of them, unfortunately, for time reasons. There's also some very good ones that are a bit less race specific that we'll aim to come back to in the future. And for anyone listening interested in joining the Race Members Club, you get members podcast, ad-free website experience. There's loads there, and yeah, we really appreciate the support. First up for you, Mark, a question from Kieran Dick, who says, how reflective is today's result for the rest of the season? Is it really a guide to how the remaining races will play out? And connected to that, Alexander Dallendorfer asked whether Bahrain was a fair representation of the grid order.
It was a fair representation for that track, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it wasn't as though there was some hidden, thing factor that which would have transformed the race. Arguably, we talked about it before. Charles Leclerc could have, had he had a problem-free race, might have got past the other Red Bull of Sergio Perez, but he wouldn't have challenged Verstappen. So I think there's reason to be optimistic that the Red Bull advantage is smaller than last year, but I'm not even certain of that. I would say that there is reason to believe, but I wouldn't be any more, certain than that, really. So, yeah, I think we're going to see some great battles between Ferrari, Mercedes, McLaren, and if with a following wind and with the right sort of circumstances, we may just see them sort of pierce the sort of armour-plated shell of Red Bull and Max Verstappen at some places. I can't really go any further than that.
Scott, a question for you from Kevin Bonfield. It looked like Max pushed in the first 10 laps and then for a couple more laps after each pit stop. How much additional margin do you believe he has in the Red Bull? We've talked about this a bit, Scott. But come on, how many more seconds could he have been up the road, do you think, if he needed to be?
10 or 15, I reckon. On this track, in those conditions, in that car, I think 10 or 15 seconds if he'd wanted to. But maybe I'll also invite Mark to chip in on that, because obviously Mark's got a better understanding of where Max was pushing and when he was holding back.
I think that's fair. I think probably a fair representation. Something like that. Something in that order.
Next question I'll take from Urban Stenshan, who says, what happens to Ferrari, especially Leclerc, with front tyre locking? Could this be a car concept problem or just track setup specific? Well, the team said they were still trying to understand it. I asked Fred Vasseur about this. He didn't think it was anything fundamentally mechanical or to do with the car. It was just that there was a temperature split across the front axle, and when you've got that, it's just not going to work because you've got one brake working far, far more than the other. That's why the car was pulling in one direction. So that there will be some reason they were trying to understand for that. But it did eventually clear, just randomly at some point as well. So I don't think it's anything fundamental to Ferrari. There'll be a specific reason, and they'll probably explain in detail in Saudi once they've worked it out.
I think Sainz suggested that they also they struggled in general with overheating brakes because maybe they were a little bit too ambitious with what they ran, having obviously not run in a train of cars for or behind other cars for a sequence of many laps in testing. Obviously Leclerc's issue set in very early, so it's entirely possible that those are unrelated, but it was interesting that Sainz raised his own concern.
Yeah, well, they'll be understanding whether there's a bigger concern there. Obviously, these teams are still feeling their way with these cars, so interesting questions to ask once we're in Jeddah. Mark, question from Vir Nikari, who says, why wasn't anybody using mediums? Surely it would have been a less risky choice for the last stint.
Just like last year, the medium wasn't as good as the hard. It was no faster, and it didn't have as long a range, so it was completely pointless tyre choice, really. The hard was a better tyre.
Yeah, you could see that right from the start of the weekend. People had obviously understood it in testing, and that tyre was being burned up pretty early on. Scott, a question from Annie Kramer, who says, with another disappointing performance, what are the odds of Logan Sargent retaining his Williams seat through the end of the 2024 season, and who are the top contenders for replacing him? Pressure being brought to bear early there.
Yeah, exactly. No respite for Logan. I mean, I might be misinterpreting the question slightly, Annie, so sorry if I am. He'll make it through to the end of the season. Whether he makes it through to 2025 or not, I think will depend on who's available, because it's a very open driver market now going forward, and I think Logan will need to up his game from last year in particular if he is to get a renewal at Williams. But this weekend, bit tricky. I mean, I was a bit worried in qualifying because it was that kind of age-old Logan problem of not quite hooking it up when he needed to on the final runs. But he had pace. That wasn't the issue. And the race was obviously wrecked by that very strange brake system issue. I think it must have been an electrical issue in the steering wheel, because they did a steering wheel change at the pit stop afterwards. But you saw as he ran down to turn 4, just went haywire and wound the brake bias miles forward. I think it was up to like 95% forward brake bias or something like that. Very, very strange. You can actually see it if you go back and find the replay of his onboard. You can see the number just like spiking upwards, like gradually just like ticking up, because it's not it doesn't just suddenly go to the new number. It's obviously increasing all the time. So very strange issue. I haven't seen something like that in that form before, and he needed a new steering wheel to resolve it. So yeah, he gets not a free pass, obviously, because he did underwhelm in qualifying, but the race was compromised for a reason outside of his control. Yeah, and I certainly don't think there's any intent within Williams to replace him, and no, during the season, I mean, and there's no obvious candidates for that. Let's move on now to a question from Tal Cohen that I'll take, who says, when you see two teammates line up back-to-back on the grid, like we did this past weekend for the Alpine cars, is it a sign the drivers are getting the most from the car and therefore shows the true pace? Well, the answer to that is it depends. It could just mean you've got two slightly mediocre drivers who are doing okay, but not brilliantly. I think in the case of the Alpine, I don't think there's any vast seams of performance they weren't exploiting. Gasly was a little bit disappointed because he was at the back of the queue when everyone was dawdling heading out onto track, so his tyre temps weren't where they should have been, so that cost him a little bit. Ocon was sort of roughly where he might have been. Gasly said, right, with a perfect lap, he might have sneaked through into Q2 or something, but yeah, I think that's where the Alpine is. So often it is the case, and I think when you've got two drivers like Ocon and Gasly, you'd normally expect, if there isn't some hard limit, one or the other of them to do a pretty good job in qualifying, because they're both capable of being very quick. They can be a bit erratic, but yeah, I think it's a fair assumption in this case, and often it is. We saw the Alfa Romeos qualified within 1,000th of each other, but the one interesting thing is, whenever you look at that,
the laps are always very different. There's gains and losses in all sorts of different places. So particularly at a track like Bahrain where you're managing the tyre, even a little bit on a qualifying lap. So I think it's offered a fair point, but it depends on the drivers ultimately. Scott, a question from Kieran Lister who says, does the fact that the points places were locked out by the top 5 teams indicate there should be an increase of points paying positions? I feel the Constructors' Championship would be better served if more teams earned points more often.
It's really tricky because sometimes I do feel this way because the point system has evolved over time, and there is an argument that it should keep evolving to reflect how the championship now looks. And if 20 cars aren't always going to finish the race, but if the proportion of, or the percentage of cars finishing the race is higher than ever and consistently above a threshold, then do you need a slightly different point system to then reflect the how difficult it is to score points? But then part of me feels like, well, but those small points are real rewards when it's getting into the top 10, and I guess it's like, rule of 10 or whatever, but it's a nice number. I don't know how I'd feel about points down to 12th or points down to 14th or something like that. I find it very tricky. The one argument I think that is very good for changing the point system and making more available is it would very potentially reduce the impact of swingy races where you have like one or two Grand Prix over a season where one team might absolutely, not luck in, but maximise it on a given day, have a car finish 5th or 7th. And if they're in that one of those tight fights where you're only sniping for a point or two every few races, that's going to basically guarantee you a certain place in the championship. Whereas maybe if you were rewarding teams down to 12th, for example, just to use that number arbitrarily, then a team that is constantly on the fringe of points is going to rack up enough of those 1-2 point finishes over the season that they're going to be protected from a team that flukes one big result. So that would be an argument that I think would be a valid argument within the pitch for changing the system.
Question now from Andrew Dale at I'll Take. Given the dominant display by Red Bull and Verstappen in Bahrain, the chances of another record-breaking season seem high. Red Bull will be able to stop development early as last year and ensure a similar result in 2025. The only way to stop this, from my point of view, would be Adrian Newey to leave or retire. Why do you think the other teams have been able to convince him to leave, given any investment in his salary would be worth it even at $100 million a year? Well, yeah. But I think Red Bull would still be pretty strong, and even without Newey, because they've also got the ideas that he's fed into that team for 2 decades now as well. But he is a unique mind and a remarkable creative force. Other teams haven't been able to convince him to leave because I think Newey isn't purely motivated by how much money you can give him. We know from his career that he wants to feel like a team is kind of his own, not in a this is all mine, but it's more just be invested in the project. And he has been at Red Bull, and he's considered moves to Ferrari. I imagine every team on the grid has tried to lure him over the past 10 years. You ask the question, whoever you are, just on the off chance. But Red Bull utilises him well. They let him play this kind of free role, which is brilliantly suited to him, and he's able to feed into the team in a way that works well for him. And I'm not sure many other teams would allow him to do that necessarily. I think plenty would just assume he was a magic bullet that you just throw in. But you have to build a team around him. Red Bull have done that absolutely brilliantly. And so why would he move from this place that he's massively built as well? He's been critical to Red Bull's success. This is his team. I remember many years ago after they won their first World Championship, interviewing him, and he said, yeah, this is kind of the unfinished business from the Leighton House days when he felt it was his team being built up, as it were. So, yeah, I just think nobody's been able to offer him a proposition to encourage him to go, and that's probably to Red Bull's credit. Right, Mark, a question from Chuck Aoki, who says, what on earth was the logic behind swapping Tsunoda and Ricciardo? Make Yuki angry so he drives faster? It's hard to see any other reason. And Danny Janowski also asked, what was the point when there was no chance of scoring points? Are they trying to cover Haas on countback?
No, Daniel was on the faster soft tyre at this time, and Yuki was on the harder tyre. And they were just behind Kevin Magnussen's Haas, and just up the road from the Haas, within striking distance, if you could have got past the Haas, was Zhou Guanyu and the Sauber. So it made perfect sense that the guy with the faster tyre had more chance of being able to pass that possibly 2 cars than the guy in the slower tyre. So they give him that opportunity. And as it turned out, he didn't have enough extra performance to be able to make a move on Kevin. So it didn't work. But it's, you always try to do the absolute maximum you can, even if it's unlikely. And say Daniel had been able to get past Kevin and Joe, he'd have been 11th, and then one retirement ahead of him. Hey, presto, he isn't a point. So it's perfectly feasible. So no, it was an entirely logical decision.
And a question now from Christopher Parrott, who says, Kevin Magnussen seemed to have a steady run, albeit out of the points. Have Haas solved their race pace issues relative to qualifying based on what we saw in the first race of the season? Do we have the evidence to say that?
Haas seems to think it does. With this car, what they have now, obviously they will upgrade it and change it through the season. That might induce some new characteristics. What they have now, they believe they've got a race setup on it and an underlying car concept, characteristic, whatever you want to call it, that can look after its tyres better. It gives them the options in terms of setup and in terms of what the drivers can do to make the tyres last. So they were actually able to fight in the midfield. And it didn't pay out because obviously Hülkenberg's error in punting Stroll on lap 1 after the bad start. But if that is the case, then with what Hülkenberg is capable of doing in qualifying, Io Komatsu, the team boss, I asked him, is Nico one of the outright fastest drivers over a single lap in F1? And I just said, yes, he is. And I agree with him. I would say he's probably top 5 on the grid for qualifying ability. And now they've got a car that, okay, it didn't on this occasion, but now they've got a car that might actually be able to cash in on that, which could be a mega weapon to have in what is going to likely be a very tight midfield fight with not that many points finishes on offer.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't look like a car that's going to be hopeless in races. That's for sure. Obviously, it's only one race, but it's quite a demanding one in terms of tyre management. So hopefully Haas have got something they can go racing with. And a question now from JK that I'll take. Given how we saw numerous examples of cars getting within 1.5 seconds of the car in front and unable to make further inroads, can we safely say that the followability of these cars is almost back to that of the pre-2022 regulations? I don't think it's that bad. It's not got back to that level. I don't have access to any... So I don't know if the FI has done any studies on this year's cars particularly. It's probably got a little bit worse than last year, but it's not as bad as it was. Doesn't mean it's good. But also, the Bahrain Grand Prix is one of those races, because there's so much tyre management, because overtaking in a car where you've got a significant advantage is quite easy to do, you tend to get yourself sorted into an order quite quickly as well. So there are a lot of people who might have been within 1.5 seconds of a car that is essentially the same pace. So I think that played a part as well. So probably the following's got fractionally worse this year, but I don't think it's back to 2021 levels. And certainly the studies they did based on last year said it was still a significant improvement on that. But it's still a big problem. They're still high-speed aero racing cars moving through the air at speed. Unless you run them in a vacuum, you're going to have turbulence. And if you run them in a vacuum, if you work out some magical way to do that, you're not going to have much downforce, are you? So there's going to be other problems. Right, Scott, to finish off, a question from Gareth Moore, who says, I do think you as journalists have done us normal fans a small disservice in how you have refused to even suggest that the rules should be changed to bring the field closer to Red Bull. I know it's a competition, but the casual fan wants closer competition at the front. F1 and Stefano Domenicali should have already made changes. I assume your answer will again go back to it's a competition. I'd rather see a competition of the best driver fighting in equal machinery. Maybe you should consider even slightly suggesting a change. I know many of us fans will lose interest along with cancelling our race memberships. You should be more open to this.
Well, I'd like to think that people are members of the Race Members Club because of many reasons, and part of that will be an appreciation of all the other things that make F1 great, rather than just the absolute outright fight at the front. But everyone's free to do what they wish. If F1's boring you and you don't want to watch F1 and you don't want the coverage, I can't stop you from cancelling it. But it's not just about it's a competition. It's just that I don't think there should be interference. And I know that there's I can see it on social this evening. There's a big debate about how often the rules were changed between 2014, for example, and 2021, and that ultimately led to Mercedes finally being toppled. And there were various changes through the year, weren't there? The car rule changes, aerodynamic rule changes, the party mode being banned effectively. All these little things that Mercedes seemed to be great at and the aero rule changes that were introduced in 2021, for example, which some people, especially in Mercedes, firmly believe was done specifically to hobble their car because it hurt the type of car that was basically only the Mercedes and the 2020 Racing Point. All these things happened, which to a greater or lesser extent was designed to hurt Mercedes and hopefully bring the racing closer together. But I don't think that should have happened. I think that should have been left alone at the time, because that is what, like I said earlier, sport is about, having the opportunity for the people who do the best jobs to be rewarded as such. So I can't in good conscience argue or suggest that should happen now, because I just don't personally believe it's right. From a regulator point of view, championship point of view, if they want to reevaluate whether or not they've made the right decisions on the regulations to allow for better quality of racing, or because they've realised they've accidentally created a framework and a set of rules across the technical side of things and the financial side of things and the aerodynamic testing restrictions and everything, to go, actually, we've actually now made it so that if you do start the regulations on the front foot, your advantage is effectively baked in for years. If they came to that conclusion and want to make some changes, I'm absolutely in favour of that. But I'm not in favour of in-season changes in particular. Change some stuff for 2025 if they really want to, or look at doing a much better job with the technical regulations and all the other framework for 2026. But I've never liked the rules being changed to hobble a team that's doing really well, and I'm not going to advocate for that now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'd certainly be open to changes if they're equitable changes, shall we say, rather than just ones just to throw a spanner in the works. Now, this has been done in F1 history, and sometimes it has produced some great seasons, unfortunately. But, well, I say unfortunately, but 21 was an example. But you want it to be fair and equitable. Now, there's a few things, because I would say you don't, just because Muhammad Ali was the greatest boxer, change the rules of boxing, because that's a bit predictable. Now, there is the point in here, you want to see it as a driver's competition. Well, great, make all the cars identical, but hang on a minute, look at F2. Look at how Prema did this weekend with two of the best drivers in the field, Antonelli and Behrman. They didn't have the cars right, and they were nowhere. And those are in identical cars. Everyone's got the exact same parts, but there's still a spread, and that will always happen, unfortunately, in motorsport. So it's very, very difficult to get to that utopia. I would say always be open to ideas of changes. I don't like what I'd call sort of a spanner in the works type change. I think that's a little bit dangerous, but certainly anything that can have that effect in an equitable way is worth considering. And F1 has closed up. There's not much you can do. You could change the rules wholesale tomorrow, or say, right, next season, completely different cars. And Red Bull would very likely still be ahead because they're the best team and they work well, etc. It's very, very difficult. But yeah, we should always be open to ideas. We'd all like to see the best drivers fighting in roughly equal machinery, but it's just very, very difficult to achieve, and often the law of unintended consequences can kick in when it comes to that. Well, that's it for our Bahrain Grand Prix review. Thanks to Scott and Mark for your insight, and thanks to everyone for joining. And if you're looking for more, we've just started the new series of the Race F1 Tech Show with Gary Anderson. The first episode's all about Red Bull and the simulation technology that's played a key role in its success, and includes an interview with technical director Pierre Vacher. We'll be packing up and heading to Saudi Arabia for the second part of this season opening Saturday doubleheader, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.